The Bear Roar Special Edition series, Bandwidth, serves as a platform to celebrate the people and stories of Dan's book, Bandwidth, the untold story of ambition, deception, and innovation that shaped the internet age and the dot-com boom. The story covers the epic journey of the creation of the internet backbones, the building of the early competitive fiber networks in the 1990s, the bandwidth boom, bust, and resurrection, ending in 2020 when Dan's company, Zayo, was sold. The book is available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble with a February 2025 release date. Head to dan-caruso.com/book for more details. In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan chats with telecom pioneer John Warta about his transformative role in shaping the fiber optic networks that redefine the industry. From working with Ross Perot at EDS to co-founding Electric Lightwave and GST Telecom, John shares fascinating stories about the early days of fiber network builds, battling monopolies, and negotiating groundbreaking deals with industry giants like AT&T and MCI. Dan and John explore pivotal moments in telecom history, lessons learned from navigating challenges, and the vision it took to drive change during the dot-com boom and beyond. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
So John Warta, I'm looking forward to this conversation. As you know, I just completed kind of a draft of the book Bandwidth. It'll be coming out in a couple months, and we'll be releasing this about the time the book comes out. And you come up multiple times in the story, and I've heard your name, in the past, and I think we exchanged emails a couple times along the way, but for the most part, our paths crossed because we intersected the same companies at times, but not necessarily each other at times. So this is going to be a fascinating conversation. And where I want to start with is the end. And the end is now. So as you think back and look back and reflect back on the crazy journey that both you went through and the industry went through, what most comes to mind, like when you think about it, and maybe from a nostalgic standpoint, how do you think about the experience?
Well, it's not uncommon, but the government intercedes into competition after it was long over. And, the Telecom Act of 96 happened long after guys like you and I started building things. And the things that 96 solved were things that we had to run into in 88, 87, 86. And there were simple things that we ran into early on. For example, the first project with Electric Lightwave, we had Lucent doing work for us in a building that was owned by US West. And it was the weirdest thing because one night we had a closed-in splice case inside that building that we were building on behalf of a circuit for AT&T. And the next day, the cabinet was busted open and stuff was laying all over the place because US West never expected anybody other than US West to have a splice box in their building. So things like that are things that are strong.
And that probably wasn't malicious. That was probably just they had, like they didn't even know what competition was. Who else would care, right?
No, you're exactly right. Some tech walked by and said, "What's his box doing here?" Didn't know it was on the engineering drawings and decided to open it up. And then eventually they figured out, okay, it really doesn't belong to us. And AT&T has the right to have a contractor in like us doing the work for them. So it was quite an interesting experience. And again, those are things that you think about at the end. I mean, if I would have thought about that in the beginning of going around making sure everybody at US West knew, I probably would have taken out a full-page ad and tried to educate.
So you, like me, started your career as part of the Bell system. Is that correct?
Well, I eventually went there, but I started working. I'm an Air Force vet and Vietnam combat experience. And when I got out of the service, I had 3 job offers: the Miami Bomb Squad, the Washington, D.C. Bomb Squad, or Ross Perot. And I went to work for Ross, and I was in both Dallas and in Denver.
And doing what for Ross at the time?
Well, I was a computer operator, so pretty simple at that time. I wasn't loading bombs and freeing his employees from Iraq.
So a lot of people who listen to this won't even know who Ross Perot is.
And it's a shame. But
tell them who Ross Perot is, both in terms of his technical kind of accomplishments, building a business of significance, but also there is a name that we all know today that most people today probably wouldn't know if it wasn't Ross Perot, and that person's name is Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
So what's the tie between Ross Perot and Bill Clinton?
Well,
I guess there as well.
yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, when I went to work for Ross, it was 1970. He had just left IBM after being the top IBM salesman in the country multiple years. In February of most years, he had already met his quota. And he got upset with IBM because they wanted to cut his compensation considerably because his job was just too easy. Well, the one thing he realized in that process was most of the companies that he sold computers to never really figured out how to operate them. And most of the computers, most of the day, were not doing anything. So they weren't fully loaded. So Ross created this company called EDS based in Dallas. And he wound up buying back.
Data Systems, is that the full name of it?
Right, Electronic Data Systems.
Yeah,
And
this
he
is when computers were, at that point, still largely standalone in someone's offices, and it served one customer, right? That was the primary setup.
Right. They were dedicated to an individual company. And what Ross did is he bought the computers back that he sold to a lot of the companies and put them in. They had 12 machines in one floor of the Southwestern Life building in Dallas. And he would rent time on those machines to a whole bunch of clients that he served before. I actually went to work and was moved from Dallas to Denver and worked at Security Life and Accident down at 16th and Glenna.
Mm.
And at that site, it was there was King Resources was in that building, one of the oil exploration companies, and we had an IBM mainframe up on the 10th floor. But every night we transmitted via Mountain Bell all of our data from Denver to Dallas so that it could be processed on these much larger machines. And then every night, every morning, the data was transferred back to us. And that's where I love to hate the phone company. Because every day I had to deal with this transmission circuit that failed time after time after time. And I hated them so badly that I eventually went to work for one and found out why they screwed up all the time.
And actually, before we go there, there's a couple more things about Ross Perot. So when you said he would buy the computers back, mainframes, I assume in those days, and then
Yes.
he would lease the capacity back, the processing back to the customers. I mean, he was a true entrepreneur because he was helping to create that business model at the time. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the machines he bought back was Blue Cross of Pennsylvania. And another one was eventually Blue Cross of California. So he did a lot of processing for Blue Cross in Texas and in those other two states. But the machines that he sold, he wound up picking back up at a deal and then turning around and providing service. And there were simple things that Ross did that were just incredible that I learned at the time. You know, one of which was there's this little company in Atlanta called the Lovable Bra Company. They manufactured kids' undergarments. And the owner of that company, for all of the history, had never had an accurate inventory. And Ross wanted this contract to buy the guy's computer and provide him services on the computer in his own facility. And he sent 24 of us from Dallas to Atlanta to do a physical inventory and counting each every one of these pieces of garments for little kids. I mean, no, we're not perverts, but it was a job that we had to create and capture that data. And we did. And of course, that guy became a customer of Ross's.
And
So he did some.
No barcodes back then to do it. You had to do it by hand.
There were several things that Ross did that were just genuinely amazing. When Houston got hit, with the hurricane, he sent a team of people down there to coordinate supplies and movement of things. So he not only did things that were great for customers, but he did great things for people.
So
I've
tell,
always,
so how is he linked to Bill Clinton?
well, I think he was involved in processing the data for the state of Arkansas. So I think that's how they initially met.
Yeah, but he also decided to run for president when
He
the
did.
election was between George Bush Sr., if my memory is correct, and this little known governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton.
Yep.
And everyone thought that George Bush Sr. would win his second term, George H.W. Bush. He certainly was favored to win it. But this guy comes along, Ross Perot, who made all this money because he became extraordinarily wealthy business person, and he decided he was going to fix the country by running as an independent and taking a shot at being elected president.
Yeah.
And he swung the election because he was from Texas. George Bush was from Texas. He drew more Republican votes. So Clinton was able to win the presidency, not because he would have won head-to-head with George Bush. He almost certainly wouldn't have. But because Perot was running, he took a lot of Bush's votes. And lo and behold, Bill Clinton becomes president.
No,
So,
you're absolutely right. I mean, Ross, I think Ross would have had an advantage on his own running, but he backed out and then started up again, when he felt there was a threat to his family. So I think he would have done some brilliant things. Like I think he would have moved the U.S. Capitol to Wichita. And that meant all of the sycophants in Washington, D.C. would wake up one morning and not know where to go because the Capitol had moved. But all of the historical parts of the United States and the buildings and monuments and so on would still be there in Washington, D.C. But the function would be moved elsewhere, whether it was Wichita or Tulsa, or I wouldn't know. But I know he was thinking in that regard and making the country's government much smaller and more efficient. So he had some great ideas, and it says a lot to have a businessman running the country as opposed to another legislator that has been around for a long time. So I know myself and a lot of people were pretty excited when he decided to run. We just wish.
Vote. I mean, didn't he get like 20% of the vote for an independent? That's
Yeah,
unheard of.
it was pretty amazing. Yeah, and again, I have some personal history with Ross as well, and that is when I interviewed with him with the company, he was one of the people that actually interviewed me. I also blame him for my second child. We only worked half days for Ross, and that was 6 hours on a computer room floor and 6 hours in the classroom. And I was asked to give a presentation on what is a manager and what does a manager mean to me. And it was, it's not a 5-minute thing. It was a 30-minute presentation. And I'm in there starting my presentation, 3-piece suit on, and Ross walks in with 2 reporters. And I could immediately feel both armpits kick in. I mean, I could feel the nervousness coming into my body. And Ross said, "It's okay, son. John, how are you? Go ahead, just keep going." So I went on for the next 28 minutes and gave my presentation. And Ross gets up at the end. "See you, John. Nice job. Talk to you later." And my half day ended in the classroom. So I went to my computer shift, and my boss came up to me. He says, "John, what the heck you doing here?" I said, "Well, did I get fired? I mean, did I do that bad?" He said, "No." So he handed me 2 front row tickets to see a dinner theater play, Man from La Mancha, at the Cotton Bowl. And there
Okay.
were Ross's tickets. He couldn't go that night. And it's probably the first time I'd seen my wife in daylight hours in about 6 months. So
A little worried about being with one of the reporters instead of your wife when the reporters came in the room. So,
it was pretty interesting, but there were things like that were very personal with Ross, and you really admired him. I think I was employee 232 at the time, which is a big company in most places, but wasn't with what EDS eventually came to be. So it was neat experience.
And do you remember how much wealth he ended up accumulating? 'Cause, I mean, it was a big number.
His sons and family are still, but when he sold to GM, EDS to GM, he wound up making a ton of money, and then he started up again with Perot Systems,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
and then they diversified into real estate, and they own a lot of buildings throughout the country.
Gotcha.
Uh,
Okay,
plus,
so you got mad at the phone company because every time you tried to bulk transmit data in the middle of the night, you ran into problems. They were monopoly. They didn't have competition, so they didn't really get too rattled up if they had unhappy customers. So
no,
you
and,
joined to fix them. Was that the plan?
well, I wound up after Ross. I went to work for Jefferson County School District, and then Portland, and both of which were just starting to do time sharing for the kids. They were able to get onto computers, both in a computer lab as well as in some of the tech schools. And again, every time we turned around, we were dealing with the phone company. And in those cases, we weren't dealing with interstate service. We were dealing with traditional services in the local community. Like Jeffco, we had 32 schools, 32 secondary schools at the time, 20 junior highs and 12 high schools. So connecting all of those and bringing them onto an HP 3000 network, was pretty darn difficult at the time, even though we're using local circuits. So, I wound up disliking the phone company. I liked the people. There were some great people at Mount, but it really became difficult for me to get my job done. And of course, the educators that I was reporting to always questioned whether it was me or the phone company or my people or the phone company.
What would
So,
the internet be like today if the only phone company was AT&T? Would we have an internet? Would society
well,
be advanced, or would we be,
it,
20, 30 years back in time?
So I have a different opinion about AT&T. AT&T Labs had all of the technology. I firmly believe this. They have all of the thought and technology that we see emerging from the internet today, back in the 80s. I've been to AT&T Labs. The people there were just absolutely incredible.
They invented the transistor. They were the pioneers behind fiber, using fiber networks. I'm sure they played a big role in wireless networks, kind of the advent of them. Yeah, I mean,
It was
a lot
just
of the
huge.
technology breakthroughs.
But there were two major issues. There was no incentive for them to roll out this technology. And two, the utility infrastructure in each of the public utility districts didn't really appreciate what they had. And unlike other countries, like Japan, for example, where the regulators did understand what NTT could roll out and bring to society, our government didn't, and they really didn't when AT&T was broken up. And I've often thought that there would have been a better breakup, when Judge Green decided to break up AT&T into pieces, into Bell companies and AT&T, the long haul company. There was a real major screw up there, and that is
It was AT&T who orchestrated that structure, right? I mean, they're the ones who proposed the solution being, hey, we're going to stay AT&T as long lines. We're going to have this Western Electric kind of division that's going to do the technology advancement, and then we're going to have 7 regional Bell companies, and so the whole conception of what the breakup would look like wasn't designed by Judge Green. He approved it,
right.
and ordered that something had to happen, but that's why it was consent. He was approving what they said would be the best solution.
No, I'm not saying AT&T was smart either. Structure,
We're monopolists.
but I always
The problem was when the monopoly went away, they were kind of, had to fend for themselves.
well that you see that's where I always thought that the monopoly should have remained in place in the local loop only. So even intrastate toll should have been open to competition. But I always thought that the cable company, the cellular company, the telco should be controlled by a single monopoly that was managed by its competitors, or not its competitors, but the competitors who use the infrastructure. So that would have, as far as the government then would have been concerned, that would have encouraged the deployment of fiber faster, quicker into more markets and more efficiently. So instead of having 11 networks going into one Wilshire in LA, you would have had one very robust network going into LA that was owned by, and I wouldn't call them a Bell company, but I would say they would be owned by some nonprofit organization. So I think that would have been a better structure. But, again, I'm looking back at that, even though I said that. I think there are some things called a natural monopoly.
Yeah.
And a local loop, I think, should have been. Now, what that would have done is it would have allowed companies like Microsoft and others to use that infrastructure and know that it's consistent, it's fair and reasonably priced, and that they have some input into the control of where things got built and where it didn't. But instead, we evolved into the structure we had, which was a real screw up. I mean, frankly, so many companies went under. So many companies overbuilt each other. So we had buildings with 6 and 7 networks and some buildings with none. And unlike the cable companies that wound up controlling each other, controlling themselves, so that, like one of my investors was Leonard Tao, and he had a portion of Los Angeles that he owned, the cable company, Century Cable. And then he had all of Puerto Rico, and he had several other locations. But he didn't have to worry about another guy going in right behind him, competing against him.
Well, they were able to develop an industry collaboration, kind of a let's honor the boundaries of each of our franchises. Let's not encroach on each other's territory. Let's swap properties with one another so that we each can get critical mass concentrations in different areas. So they were able to hold together an environment largely led by John Malone, I think it's fair to say, that allowed the industry to continue for years and years, where cable companies just would not compete with each other at the facility level. Now, at the content level, different. So as you got higher level up, if someone wanted to do HBO and someone else wanted to do Showtime, that would be a form of competition. But at the serving the home level, they had a pact and they stuck to it almost across the board, where they did not step on each other's toes. That's why there was one cable company. It wasn't that because the law said there can only be one. The law did not say we're only awarding one franchise. But once a company was established, what was called an overbuilder, someone who would overbuild a cable company, they just wouldn't do it to each other.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And one of the guys that was on a board of mine that with a company I was involved in called American Network was Don Fisher. So Don was Malone's CFO, and I spent a lot of time learning from him about the way they approach competition. Basically, they had invested in a long distance company, and Pacific Telecom or Pacific Core invested in a long distance company, and I went over as an officer running that company called American Network. And we merged. Our American Network took over the operation that Malone had invested in. And, from that, they were quick to point out that, look, if you don't have this advantage or built-in advantage, why are you opening up all of these central offices to provide toll services in? And it was the same thing when we moved into building fiber infrastructure, 4 or 5 years later. So it's quite an interesting. What we're talking about is a lot of people made a lot of decisions, and the question is, were they right? And what happened to you and I is that you could go into Fidelity in Boston and walk out with $60 to $80 million after a 30-minute presentation, and you looked at the bench to see who's following you in the room, and it's your competitor, and they walk out with similar amount of money to compete in the same markets you're in.
Yep.
I had that experience with Brooks. I was going in Tucson. I had been in Tucson for a year, and we walked out with $60 million to develop the network there, and they walked out with similar amounts of money. So it was crazy because unlike the cable guys who had I think it was the financial guys that really restricted how they operated and not overbuilt each other. But everybody thought there was so much market for us to obtain that they just kept throwing money at it.
So when did you first begin your journey in competing against the Bell companies with newly built fiber network? What was the geography? What was the company name? What sparked you to do that? Because you were one of the true pioneers of beginning
kind of like
some.
you, but in 84, 85, I was involved with this long distance company, and I was the chief operating officer. I kept being frustrated with I couldn't get good circuits intrastate, so everything that I could do interstate was just starting to open up. I mean, I met all the NTN partners. Larry McLernan and I are still good friends. He's from LCI, and Roy Wilkins and Clark McLeod. I mean, I met all of those guys in the 85, 86 timeframe.
All pioneers.
All pioneers.
Yeah,
And
we're in long distance competition, but Clark McLeod in both wireless, but certainly in early fiber networks. And then the other person you mentioned, Roy Wilkins, pioneer in intercity fiber networks. So those are all kind of part of the really early crew. I'm still trying to graduate from college at that point, and it took me 5 years, by the way.
I'm still trying.
Yeah, your college training in Vietnam. By the way, thank you for your service. I'm sure we could do a full podcast on what you must have experienced in that era.
But the interesting thing, so was in 86, I left the security of Pacific Core and working for a public company. And I went out on my own. I interviewed with Clark, I interviewed with Roy, and I met this young guy in Madison, Wisconsin, Jim Rice. And Jim had assembled 5 or 6 electric utilities. And I met some very good people from Alcoa. And we started looking at those utilities that were involved and using the electric utility infrastructure to build fiber optic networks. And most utilities needed some level of communications, and they were equally as frustrated in dealing with the Bell company as we were.
And they needed to attach their power plants together. What were they using it for themselves?
Well, each utility had a control center in which they moved the energy from different locations to sources and uses of the power. So that infrastructure was very important to them. And they also used it to manage and control their equipment. So they could turn things on, turn things off, monitor things, monitor electrons moving through the cable. Now, one of the cables that we recognized was an important one was the top cable, which was an electric lightning rod cable. And fiber is immune to lightning. So Alcoa created a cable that was called an optical ground wire that basically would take a lightning strike as long as it was properly grounded and let fiber run through it. So we started developing a network from Chicago to Minneapolis through Wisconsin, and going through areas that were difficult for normal construction, areas where there's a lot of rock and a lot of crossings and rivers and so on. So being all aerial, our costs were dramatically different than somebody plowing on a train.
And the build a lot quicker too.
We built a lot quicker, and we didn't have derailment.
It's already owned by utilities, so you didn't have to go work with a bunch of people who own land to try to convince them to let you put fiber cable in the ground.
You're absolutely right. We always had 1 or 2 holdouts that held the critical right of way, and I'm sure you probably experienced the thing, but every now and then, once we ran into an old guy like that or old gal like that that owned this property for 100 years, we just started putting up poles around her on the public highway. And after about the third or fourth pole that went up, they realized we could go around them, and they got really reasonable at that point to deal with. So it was kind of
Yeah,
an
it's
interesting.
interesting. What we're talking about is, if someone owns private land, they're not obligated to let you put a fiber cable in, under the land or even
Moreover,
or over it. That's their land. This is so unless there's some extreme uh, case to be made, you have to go work out a deal with them, and there's no set pricing. They could charge whatever they could get away with charging. So if they think they could hold up a really big, expensive project, they'll hold you up until you fork over a lot of money in order to convince them to do it, or until you show them, as John is sharing with us, that it might be difficult, but you could work around them, and then they get nothing. So that's
yeah.
how those negotiations would play out.
Yeah, sometimes you had to play hardball, and when you had a big utility like we did in Wisconsin that had done this before, again putting up two or three poles, was something that showed you could go around this person, then that person would get more reasonable. But we realized that there was an advantage in certain markets to optical ground wire, and I wound up working on the Norlight project for about 9 months to a year. Brought in the initial contracts I brought in were from MCI that just wound up buying a big chunk of the network, and also spurred us to build up to Green Bay, to build a ring from Milwaukee to Green Bay to Minneapolis and then back to Chicago. So I liked that idea so well that Alcoa and I sat down, and I asked Alcoa, I said, well, you got a great product. Who's out marketing it? Well, John, we're selling 2, 3 miles to a utility to connect a substation to a power plant, and we're doing this, that, and the other thing. Well, why don't we go after these carriers? So the two of us, Alcoa and I, wound up, and Alcoa had this incredible guy, Don Branscombe, who worked for Alcoa for, I think, 100 years. But he had sold everything. He sold chicken sheet. That's the sheet that sits under chicken. That's the aluminum that connects the sheet. And he sold aluminum to the Bud Company that built rail cars. He sold aluminum to the Bay Area Rapid Transit. So this guy was just absolutely incredible. 6'7". He actually bought with Elvis Presley during his army tour in Germany.
Really?
So, I mean, he was an amazing guy.
What did he say about Elvis? Did he tell you what Elvis was like?
He just laughed. He says he had more girls than Don did. So that was the story there.
More girls than Gandhi.
But Don and I started looking at and getting maps from every carrier. So AT&T gave us their maps of where they wanted to build, and then MCI would do it. Sprint was more standoffish. They had their engineering team that nobody could do anything better than them, and so we never got anywhere with them. But we got a lot of traction with MCI and AT&T. And the first big system I put together was TVA and MCI. So I would go in, Alcoa would introduce me to the right people at the utility. I would then go in and meet with them, and they would listen to my pitch, which is I'm going to come in and train you and teach you what the opportunity is. And if you want to go forward, then I'll move into a marketing hat. So I'll go from teacher or trainer into marketing. And I wound up putting together about 15 large scale deals of fiber in different parts
And
of the
when you would wear the marketing hat, so you're leading the sales effort for Alcoa, but when you put on your marketing hat, was that to help the utility find customers like the AT&T and MCI?
Absolutely. So with AT&T, for example, we knew AT&T wanted to cross Montana, and I had gone into Montana Power, which had a deregulated subsidiary called Touch America.
Oh yes.
Mike Meldal and their team, Tom Hogan, And they were doing microwave builds for utilities across the country, but they had not thought about fiber. So Alcoa and I went in and we told him, said, look, here's the deal. John will charge you a monthly fee for about 3 months. He'll be here 2 weeks out of every month, maybe 3. He'll go through all of the processes of what's involved. And we covered regulatory issues, construction issues, technology issues, and so on. And then after that, if you decide you want to go, then we'll unleash John and have him go sell and market the potential use of your network to the carriers. So that worked very well. In Touch America, they said go, and I wound up getting AT&T to buy from Thompson Falls, Montana, into Billings, and it was a great deal for us. I mean, the other deals I did were more consulting.
What was your cut of the deal? So let's say on a deal
Well, okay, so all right, I think it's public, but I would get about $75,000 in contracts for the educational portion of it, 50 to 75, and then I would get a piece of the deal after the costs were recovered.
Yep.
So in this particular case, Montana Power got 60% of the profit after all costs were covered. Alcoa got 15%, and I got 25%. So
would keep 25% of the upside of the ups.
So they got so the typical cost, the typical cost was about 60% of the selling price.
Yep.
So, and there was maintenance that was added on that I didn't participate in because I didn't want to, because that was after the deal was done and they went on. But in that particular case, I made $3.5 million. But again, I was working without a salary. I was working on my own. I had 4 kids at home and a wife complaining, "You're never home. What's going on?" But that was perhaps one of the best deals I did, especially early on. It was like 87 timeframe.
Yeah, so $3.5 million back then, I don't know, it was worth.
That was real money.
Yeah, that's probably worth $20 million by today's dollars, perhaps, but something significantly more than that.
So I did several deals like that. TVA, because it was a government deal, I couldn't get a commission on the deal, but I got a lot of things along the way that were very useful and beneficial. So Alcoa and I had a very good relationship. They got the cable deal. They used all of their industry experience in the utility business. And then they got all of the follow-on business. They got all replacement supplies. They got splicers. They got all kinds of continuing services to the utility industry. So it worked out to be great. And that was kind of the start of me doing a lot of long-haul stuff. So we did 865 miles with TVA, 123 miles with Louisville Gas, 190 miles with Public Service Indiana. That tied one whole section of MCI together. And then we did the AT&T deal. We did a couple others like that. There were some where
at this stage, you're out there putting together these deals, helping the utilities kind of build out fiber on their own right away, marketing and kind of leading the sales process to get revenue on there, collecting a cut of the deal. But at some point, you kind of transition from putting together these deals to, hey, I'm going to go and actually build a company that uses the fiber to offer lit services to others. How did that transition?
So now I walk in on a Friday night with a suitcase full of dirty clothes, and I was
a suitcase full of cash from these deals you've been cutting.
And it was both coaching Premier Soccer, and because I have 4 sons, all 4 played Premier, and I was still playing on Sundays myself. So I would walk out Sunday night off a soccer field, and my wife would hand me a washcloth, a towel, and my suitcase, which now had clean clothes in it, and my suit. And after enough time, she said, "That's enough. You've been playing too much. We got 4 sons. I've been raising them myself because you've been gone so much. So you got to start something locally. So so at this point, I had picked up a partner. I brought in a young guy by the name of John Rivenberg, who worked for Rogers Cable TV, and they own Portland, a franchise in Portland, plus they're Canadians, so they had a lot of operations there. But John was pretty smart. He understood franchises. He understood marketing and sales. And we started working locally. So we started calling on Idaho Power, Washington Water Power, Puget Power, Portland General, Seattle City Light, Pacific Core. And we started calling on all of those guys. And lo and behold, we get this meeting with Portland General. And I'm told, John, you've been working with the development guys. Now we've got a team you're going to go meet with. I walk into this off the elevator, and here's this guy looking back at me and saying, I can't believe it. This guy's name is Earl Kamsky. I was his backup in high school. I played football for Lane Tech. Earl was a high school All-American, massive head. He had a helmet that Rydell made that was actually 2 helmets they glued together. So they took 2/3 and put a spacer in the middle. And he was a state wrestler, top wrestler in the state. And I had no clue that he had left Chicago, went to law school, went to Mexico for a couple of years, learned Spanish, played the guitar, and now was working for Portland General and was being assigned by them to work with me on considering and looking at these long haul routes and developing a local network in the city. So I put up some of my money. They put up some of their money. We put the teams together. We developed the business plan. We got a franchise for Portland. We got pole attachment. We got tower attachment from the utility. We cut a deal with Northwest Natural Gas to take over all of their inactive gas pipelines that were passable. So I only paid for what I passed with the rods.
By passable, you mean you could
get through them
into the pipeline.
So basically, we stuck a rod of fiberglass down the pipeline, and if we got distance, we knew we could pull a cable in. Some cases we'd only go 10 feet. Some cases we'd go 1,000 feet. So we negotiated that, and then we were doing the same thing in Seattle. And we were walking into a meeting with Dick Wrighton, who was the president, CEO, and Ken Harrison was chairman. And they were about to write a check for $10 million to launch Electric Lightwave. And they told me,
Electric Lightwave, did they already have that name, or were you bringing that?
I had the name.
Okay.
I formed the name because I was thinking my Alcoa days and working with all these electric utilities. I always thought that the utilities had duct work, they had towers, they had poles, and so on. So that's why I named it Electric Lightwave. Long story short, we went into this meeting, and they told us they had to back out. So after 9 months of working together, they said they had to pull out. And it was because they had a nuclear power plant called Trojan on the Columbia River that was leaking. And front headlines of the newspaper, the Oregonian, was Portland General's in trouble, rate cases, hearings, CEO being called in front of the commission so they just couldn't stand the pressure of launching a new company. So we wound up at that point. Thank you. We got everything that we had done together. We got all the right of way agreements, the franchise, and so on. And now I'm standing there saying, what do I do? So I knew the Intermedia folks, Barbara Sampson from Intermedia out of Florida. And I asked her, I said, okay, Barbara, who are you dealing with for money? And she told me, she gave me John Baker's name, Baker Capital. And then there was a guy by the name of Rod Hackman I had met. And then obviously Andy Littman, everybody knew Andy. So I wound up hitting up all of these people who had Wall Street.
Was an attorney in the DC area. He had a very significant role in my career, actually, because he and I started working closely together on, I don't know if it was right-of-way agreements at the time or if it was some of the early agreements associated with the Telecom Act of 96. But he was very close to Crow, and he would go and tell Crow, I don't know if you know this guy Caruso, he works, a couple levels down the organization, but he's the real deal. So Andy, even if I run into him to this day, Andy, he'll fondly remember, and I'll bring up my gratitude for the role that he played in kind of helping get me on the radar of Jim Crow at a relatively, early point in my career.
Well, at that point, I was his second largest client, and you named his first. Him with level 3 was Andy's first, but we followed right behind that because we recognized Andy. But so I wound up hiring, a banker to help me, and Earl, my friend Earl Kamsky that joined us, he had a daughter that at 2 years old had glaucoma, and he was very comfortable working for the utility with all of the benefits and healthcare and so on. So I had, in order to convince him to join us at Electric Lightwave, I had to provide or obtain that. And, most venture people could care less about health insurance. And so, but it was one of the key decision makers. We had an offer from Baker Capital, and I got an offer from Citizens Utilities in Stamford. And we put the two together, and the decision was Earl. We knew we needed Earl. He was an attorney, spoke Spanish fluently. A lot of the markets we were targeting were in the Southwest. And he was just this incredible guy. So we wound up going with Citizens. And that was one of the best and worst decisions I'd ever made.
It was Citizens and Baker, or just Citizens?
Just Citizens, because we were only going after 10 million.
Citizens was Citizens Utilities, and their serving territory was what at the time?
Well, they owned 34 small telcos, like Kingman, Arizona, Redding, California, but they also owned other utilities, like they owned Kauai Electric. They owned Louisiana Gas Company. So they had operations throughout the United States. And they had just changed ownership, internal ownership and control, virtually the day that we signed the deal. So the Citizens got started by two attorneys that were incredible at chasing ambulances. And anytime there was a husband or grandfather who died in the utility industry, these two attorneys showed up to talk to the widow. And they wound up buying and amassing 40 or 50 utilities that were making 10 to 15% every year on their activity. And they were able to buy them and bring them in to Citizens and pay a dividend. They had 53 years of progressive dividends. So from mid 1940s on. And the guy that bought them was a cable guy. Leonard Tao bought control. And they wound up switching the telco operations. They brought in a bunch of guys out of Centel, out of Chicago, to run the majority of the utility operations. And that was a shocker to us because we had done this deal. I'm in Hawaii with a soccer team that I coached, and we were Washington State Premier champions. We're having a great time. We just launched this company, and their first check bounced. Leonard Tao had taken over the company, and he wanted me to know who was in charge of the money. So he eventually bounced the first check and told me to get my ass back to Stanford to sit down and meet with him because he wanted to go through our deal.
Okay.
This is like
So this transition with Citizens happens just as you're getting started. You cut your deal, and next thing you know, they sold the company to, or brought in this cable TV to take over the company.
And the guy I negotiated the deal with disappeared, Dennis Soder. I still to this day don't know what happened to him.
Yep.
Anyway, we were able to constitute the company. We got going. We started the marketing. We landed Good Sam Hospital in Portland. I got a nice contract from AT&T to connect them to our international cable that my old company built to Japan, to Alaska. I got a massive contract with Boeing in Seattle. to connect 4 of their locations around Lake Washington. And we launched the company. It took off. We started doing well. We wound up having some interesting things going on. I would show up at a citizens meeting and they would go around the room as to who did what this quarter. And it'd be like, well, let's see, in Redding, California, there were 32 new building permits, and that'll generate 41 new monthly revenues of $32.50 a month. John, what did you do? Oh, I landed Boeing to
Yeah.
to a multi-million-dollar contract to control their access to the internet and to the world.
At the time, Boeing wouldn't have had many choices other than the phone company, right?
Well, the phone companies, and that's why we got the contract. They were dealing with GT
companies because
in US West. They needed dark fiber to build the 777.
Yeah.
So they were trying to connect 14 locations in the Seattle area. And that was the problem. They had this tremendous problem with these 2 companies arguing back and forth whether they would let them have dark or not have dark, or whether it was dark, but they would moderate how much they could move over it and when. And so it was just a pain. So we wound up going in there saying, you can have whatever you want. So they came in and spoke for us at the PUC, got us the authority to provide the service, and then entered into a massive contract with us. Not only did we serve their locations, but all of those locations had to go through us to go elsewhere.
And so this is like 1990, what, 3 time frame?
91.
91 time frame. And for those listening in, to put in perspective, the company John's talking about, Electric Lightwave, is a company that I bought years later. So let's see, that would be, around 2000, probably 16. So how many years later? That 26 years after John got this company launched and accelerated with this big deal from Boeing.
Yeah,
we ended up at Zayo buying and making Electric Lightwave, and other companies that were brought together with Electric Lightwave, part of the Zayo portfolio.
Yeah, Dan, you did a tremendous job putting them together. And I mean, people around the world know that what you've done, and they respect what you did and how you did it. It was not easy. But at that point, going back to ELI at that stage, we weren't a company. I mean, we basically were not making money. We had no prospect of making money in the short term because we were building. I mean, we were a construction company. That's what we did day in and day out. And we spent a lot of time targeting major buildings, and we ran into all of the problems everybody had. For example, one of the biggest building in Portland is a 36-story building, the big pink tower, Power of Tower. And we pulled into that building into a parking structure using one of the Northwest Natural Gas pipes. And there was no gas in it, but the smell from the pipe was still in the pipe. It's actually a smell they inject into the pipe intentionally. So if you smell that, you think you've got a leak. And sure enough, my guys went home at 4:00 that day and never sealed up the pipe completely. So the entire garage of the parking structure smelled like gas. This is like a Friday night. So by Monday, all these people came into the parking structure with the smell, and they thought the building was going to blow up. And so there are things like that I had to
resolve. Like, what do you do in that situation?
We just had to seal the pipe. They had to basically put putty around. Yeah, well,
right away, no, this isn't a gas leak.
Fortunately, we didn't get thrown out of the building. We were able to explain that the contractor screwed up, and fortunately, this building owner had a few other things like that. But we were basically trying to go from the Pittock building, Portland, through US West building where we served AT&T, over to this pink building, and then to get to Wiltel and create a ring back to the Pittock. And going through this largest building in town was, a good option. So I started trying to figure out how do you get customers in that building? Now we have a physical presence there. Well, dealing with the lawyer for the building and the building manager, they really don't care about me being successful. They just want money.
Yeah,
So
it's kind of like a landowner who sees you coming from a couple miles away and says, well, across my land, they got their hands out while you go into a building and you want to provide kind of new services, important new services to the customers in the building. And the building owner says, well, time out here. What's in it for me?
exactly. And we kept trying to tell them, look, the customers will come to you just because you have this technology. And of course, that was met with bullshit.
Yeah.
You know, so what wound up typically happening is that we would walk in and say, well, we'll pay you what you're getting from US West or from GE. Well, they have to be here. What do you mean they have to be here? They don't have to be here. We're now authorized to compete with them. So they don't have to be here any more than we do. So why don't you treat us the same as them, and that'll encourage us. Well, what else can we do for you that we can do and you'll pay us for? So that's when we'd build networks through buildings to get to the other street instead of having to go out into the public right of way and pay the city a franchise fee. So we did a lot of deals like that to get by. Then anytime you want,
you have to be creative. You have to be a salesperson all the time, right? Because you're trying to sell to whoever's trying to hold up and collect money from you. You have to find a way to get them to let you do what you want to do without giving them a shitload of money. And it was frustrating because you're looking at your competitor, the telephone company, and the telephone company doesn't have to do any of that. They just sit there and laugh.
So we wound up renting offices in the building, for a short time so we could demonstrate our technology. We had a gal or a guy and a gal and a guy sitting in the lobby handing out coffee and roses and donuts and cupcakes and so on. I mean, we did virtually everything we could to try to get people in the building to think about what we were doing and to come see us. And in some cases, we were successful. In others, we had the worst possible salespeople in the world working for us. Their best sales came from the bar at night. And the person that they talked to, they had no clue what building or buildings they were in. But I knew one thing. They weren't in a building we already were in.
They never are.
They always wanted another new building. So there was a point in which, in Electric Lightwave days, when we're in 300 buildings with 305 customers. So we basically were in 5 buildings that we had 2 customers in. And that very, very frustrating. But that was the start. And, so a lot of people in our industry then would take that and go focus on carriers. So they would go look at like MCI or AT&T and say, okay, you're going to go to AT&T and AT&T wants into 1,000 buildings. And if you're only in 300, what are they going to do for the other 700? Because if you take 300 away from that, and those 300 are the biggest ones where they have most clients, Bell's going to readjust their price and stick it to them. And that's what we ran into. I mean, Dan Hesse, the guy that ran T-Mobile, I think, he was my guy at AT&T that I had to get.
I think Dan ended up at Sprint, not T-Mobile, but at the time he was with AT&T.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. But he was with AT&T when I met with him, and he was in charge of access. So I would go sit down with him at Bedminster, Basking Ridge, and I would beg him to open up the doors. And he said, John, I'll tell you what, you give me a 60% discount and I'll consider coming in with you and I'll put more stuff in. And I would go run the numbers. I always carried a laptop with me and I'd run the numbers and I'd say, oh, that's tight. How about 45 or 50? And we'd start getting some nods going around. And then he'd pull out the paper that he calculated the 60. He'd say, no, John. I don't want 60% of list price. I want 60% of what I'm paying Bell now. So he wanted 60% discount off of a discount that was negotiated based on Bell having 100% of their business
Yeah.
in order to switch to use a new emerging competitor. So I'm sitting there saying, well, doesn't make a lot of sense to spend time with these carriers because we're not going to get anywhere if they're all locked into these long-term deals. Fortunately, we found enough one-off areas or one-off projects that gave us enough activity to keep the company moving and so on. And one of those, I mentioned Citizens, but there were a couple things about Citizens. One, Aniki hit Kauai when Citizens owned Electric Lightwave. And Leonard Powell.
That was a hurricane? What was it?
Hurricane, yeah. It's just like today, they're being hit by the third hurricane this week.
Yep.
But Aniki destroyed a lot of the infrastructure on Kauai, a lot of the power infrastructure. And Citizens knew my connections with all the utilities in the West and my relationship with Alcoa. So I wound up spending like a month and a half doing nothing but organizing away from my Electric Lightwave job, but helping Citizens move all the supplies they needed to Nellis in Las Vegas because the Air Force was flying everything over for free. So we had to help them put poles together and transformers and cable and so on. And all of that stuff happened. So there were some good things that we did to help Citizens. They eventually wound up selling Kauai Electric, but they were able to restore service to Kauai very quickly. And a lot of the same people that worked for Southern Cal Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric had just come back from Homestead in Florida that had just gone through the same thing. Hurricane hit there. So
take us back to the new guy comes in to Citizens. He wasn't part of doing the deal with you. He says, come here and tell me what you're up to. What happened in that meeting and what happened, in the aftermath of that meeting?
Well, okay. So remember I had made a little bit of money along the way. So I'm sitting there and I had 3 other founders of Electric Lightwave, one of which had a daughter with glaucoma. So I didn't want to appear cavalier. I didn't want to appear overly obnoxious in the meeting, but I was pretty pissed that this guy wanted to renegotiate our deal.
Yep.
And this is, I had met him, but I never knew what he was aspiring to become. And it wasn't pleasant. I was with him by myself, one-on-one in a conference room. Well, actually in his lunchroom. He had his own private lunch room. And he made $10 million a year from multiple companies, including Citizens, but Centennial Cellular and Century Cable. And I told him, I said, Leonard, this is our deal. We're expecting you to hold up on it and own up on it. And he says, well, let's see how things go. So virtually every year after that, I got summoned to have a similar discussion with him. And in the last year that I was there, my boss, my direct report, was a guy by the name of Don Robertson. Don was a Centel guy out of Illinois. And, he was one of those characters that made stuff happen and built things. And he told me, he said, John, we're having a massive problem in Kingman, Arizona. For the last 4 years, my guys have been trying to justify building a new fiber route from Vegas to Phoenix. And they can't seem to get it done. I said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do, Don. You put it in writing that we have the same deal on this that I have on opening new cities with Electric Lightwave. And I'll take that project on and I'll have it cash flowing with commitments within 2 weeks. You're kidding me. I said, no, Don, put it in writing and I'll go take care of it. So he put it in writing, and my deal with Citizens is every time I opened a new city, I had the right to earn 20% of the investment in that city. 10.6% went to me. The other 9.8% 4 was broken up to the other 3 guys. And I went to Tulsa. I sat down with Roy Wilkins. I said, Roy, I'm going to give you a deal from Phoenix to Vegas. Are you interested? He was thrilled to death because that was one city he couldn't get to on his own build. And I said, I'll try also to build Phoenix to San Diego, but I got to get this piece done for the guys that are in Kingman. Kingman sits right in the middle between Phoenix and Vegas. And I said, but here's the deal. I'll sell you 8 fibers after 4 years. I'll rent them to you for 4 years. So the first 4 years, you'll have full access to all 8 fibers, put whatever capacity on it you want. And then after 4 years, I'll sell those 8 fibers to you. Well, that basically allowed citizens to collect 120% of what their costs were to build it. They also immediately eliminated the use of US West, who was providing the connection from Centel in Vegas to Phoenix. And I earned 10.5% to do 2 weeks of work. About
And a shitload of value to them, during those 2 weeks, right? I mean, that it wasn't just 2 weeks of work; it was the value, that you created for them, both paying for the route, saving money on them, the services they presumably had to give US West a lot of money for. So you delivered.
I had that exact same feeling, and it's something they couldn't do in 4 years' time. I did in a little over 2 weeks. So a week after I had done this, and I had it in writing that the deal was the same as our deal, I got a call from Don Robertson. And Don said, John, this isn't going over well. What do you mean? He says, well, we're giving up a lot of money on this. I said, yeah, but it pays for itself. You got to build it, and over 4 years, you're totally paid for it. Yeah, but Leonard. Well, what do you mean but Leonard? Well, Leonard doesn't like it. Okay, well, it's our deal, and I'm expecting you to hold up to it. So a week later, I get another call from Don. And on the call now is Daryl Ferguson. Daryl was the president of the company. Don was my senior VP in charge of all telecom. And Daryl was repeating basically what Don told me the week before. And I said, Daryl, look, this is our deal. You guys knew the deal. You got Don. You gave Don permission to sign it. He said, yeah, I did, but I didn't get Leonard. I said, it's not my problem. And I said, I think I've done a hell of a job getting this thing done for you. It's a problem you haven't solved in a long time. So we ought to be okay. Well, the next week I got notice that I was to start laying off employees. And our budget had been pared back, and that I was to cut half the staff. So I went to the other 3 founders and told them, I said, look, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm going to leave. And I'm just not going to deal with this. So I wound up a week later, I wound up leaving, and then wound up having to sue citizens.
Did they tell you to cut the staff because they wanted to send a message to you that, hey, maybe you have this contract here, but we could, we could give you
got
help.
It.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the only leverage that they could think of that would cause me to, come to terms with them. Well, I didn't come to terms with them. I told them, look, you can have the company, and I turned around and wound up having to sue them. I got a nice settlement in Denver about a year later, so that worked out very well. I was and am still extremely disappointed in the loss of control of Electric Lightwave and the friends. I mean, at that point, we had 50 to 100 employees. I was involved in hiring each and every one of them. They were good people, worked hard, and I knew that I was the impediment to them losing their job or not. So by leaving, citizens suddenly decided to put money back into it. They poured more capital into it. They brought in one of their telco guys out of Redding, California, to run it, and he screwed everything up. And that's when they brought in Dave Sharkey after that. And Dave was a good man, cable background, very sharp individual. So Citizens made a great choice by bringing him in. But they also didn't have to give up the 10.5% equity to him once they got me out. So, I feel I did okay with the settlement, but not as good as I probably would have long term.
So you weren't done though. So
No,
Electric Lightwave keeps going on, and you're just, in a lot of ways, you're just getting started. So
well, that's
play.
So I wound up, my two older boys had just graduated from college. They had been involved with me on a peripheral basis at Electric Lightwave. One did CAD drawings for us and so on. The other one had been involved in looking at some of the markets that we were targeting and doing some investigation on potential opportunities. And another one of their buddies. So the four of us started working out of the house, trying to figure out what to do and where to go next. And we knew there were a number of markets that hadn't been claimed. And I wound up meeting the guys that were involved with ICG. They were a Canadian group that had invested in ICG in Denver, which is a company you were involved with.
Another company that, not as part of Zayo, but right before Zayo, I acquired ICG. It was a public company, distressed, about ready to go into its second bankruptcy, and with the backing of some private equity specialists in this area, we bought it, took it private, and really, in many ways, that gave me a big restart of my career. So the investor, but back, I don't know these investors, they would have been long gone by the time I got there.
Yeah.
So who were these investors that you started working with?
So this is a Canadian group that had helped take ICG public out of Vancouver. Gordon Blankstein and his brother Rob. They also had a Wall Street key guy that had joined them, and then they had a European guy, Ian Watson, who was chairman. And they approached.
Is the New York guy, presumably?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So they approached us, and we the boys found them, and we had a great meeting. Bob Hansen was the CFO of the company at the time, and he was a Merrill Lynch guy at one point. Lived in Wyoming, lived up in Cody, and we got together. And I had a relationship through Alcoa, through my days working with Alcoa, with a company called Toyomenka or Tolman, and I knew what I was going to do in terms of building more cities. So one of the things I did was I got a financial commitment from Tolman to do project financing for me. And they put up $100 million of project financing. And they had the right to earn 5% of the equity of each of these companies. Plus, they were able to sell us product, including Alcoa cable and Fujitsu gear, based upon our need, as long as they were competitive. So I had a competition defined to include delivery specs and so on. So I had that already acquired and in my laundry basket. And we wound up meeting with the Canadians. They were enamored with me bringing in a company like Tolman that had $32 billion a year in revenue and did project financing all over the world. And that made a great story for a Canadian company. Now, this is a Canadian mining company, not Bitcoin mining, but a company that was doing mining that went defunct. The Blankstein brothers picked up the shell, and they started raising capital in units. So you'd buy a share for a quarter, and you'd get a second unit for another 37 cents or something like that a year later. And they eventually built it up so it was trading when I got involved at about $2 a share. And we got, pardon me?
So yeah, I found you.
So it was trading at about $2. And the only asset they had was a bankrupt software company in Salt Lake that was selling calling cards and machines. They actually built a billing machine and calling switch that would process calling cards. So I wound up joining them. I originally was just running the new telco operation. I eventually wound up becoming chairman of the whole company, but that took like 4 years for me to progress from just being president of the fiber side on. But the company itself, the share, so I wound up getting like 2 million shares, and it just as compensation over time, no vesting, but it was doled out over a certain period of time. And my 3 boys that were involved with me, young guys, joined me, and they got a piece of that. And then I brought in my CFO, who got a piece of that, and we all earned stock options and so on beyond that.
And how much cash did they have, or was it in what?
They had 9 million.
So they had 9 million cash when you joined.
Right. And
really no business, but they're a public company worth about $2 a share. So what did you guys do with that money?
So we wound up bringing in my Japanese trading company partner, and we built business plans for 3 markets: Tucson, San Bernardino, Riverside, and Hawaii. So those are the 3 targeted markets that we went into.
With the idea of building out fiber networks.
Right. Into
so you're going to third-tier markets that, haven't yet had a lot of competition. So you're going to build out fiber.
We're the first in all 3 markets. So in all 3 markets, we broke the monopoly for local phone service. And in doing that, Tolman committed $10 million to each project as their project financing part. And we used that, the Blanksteins used that announcement and those announcements of the markets we were going in to raise additional capital. So we got the shares up to $5 a share, and then, continue. I think the highest we got was like 19 or $20.
And the name of this company?
It was called GST Telecom, which was actually called Green Star Mining was the original company.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I didn't like Green Star, so I changed it to just GST. What did GST stand for? GST.
Yeah.
So there was no name.
Star.
But Green Star Mining was the original mining shell. And we wound up developing those 3 markets going in. It was brutal. And some of them in Tucson, it got ugly with Brooks. We actually wound up winning a lawsuit against them, and the city of Tucson's city attorney lost his job.
What was the lawsuit over?
They sat on our applications pending Brooks having time to come in and organize and come compete. And they actually issued building permits to them before they would issue them to us. So we nailed them, and they wound up having to give us half of their network they had constructed in the entire city. And the city...
They being the city or they being Brooks?
Brooks.
Okay.
And the city attorney lost his job, and I don't know if he went to jail, but he was reprimanded.
And then just to put it in context, so when you become a local carrier, local telephone carrier, in those days, well, still to this day, but it was new back then, it gave you the rights of being a public utility. And as a public utility, the cities were obligated to treat all the utilities in an equal way. But the cities didn't necessarily buy into that because they, just like the building owner example earlier and the landowner, a lot of the cities were like, okay, you need permits from us. We don't really care what the federal law is. What are you going to do for us in exchange? So they would test the boundaries. They would play favorites. They would try to collect fees from the new competitors that they couldn't collect from the Bell companies. So they try to make a name for themselves in the political scene at the expense of would-be competitors. And we'd always be trying to point out to them that this is good for your community. This is good for the citizens of your community, the business of your community, because what we're bringing is kind of more bandwidth options at lower prices that you just don't otherwise get. And many of them just didn't give a shit, right? Many of them are like, yeah, whatever. What's in it for me, the public official?
Well, especially if you walked away with a check from the competitor, and you sat on the other guy's nest and wouldn't let him go do anything. But so that was also pre Telecom Act of 96 when this happened. This is in 94, 95. So we got that turned around. Tucson became a decent market for us. San Bernardino Riverside was phenomenal. My oldest son went down there, started making sales left and right. I mean, it was just like the community was so welcoming and open to us. We picked up the University of California, Riverside, and picked up the one in Pasadena. We opened up Ontario, so we got a lot of FedEx business out of that airport and that facility. And we cut a deal with Southern Cal Edison to use their transmission lines that they had already built fiber on. So we had picked up a lot of fiber there. That was our first holes that we poked into one Wilshire. I think I poked like 10 holes in that building over time.
And one Wilshire was to this day,
that was the merger spot.
The networks came together.
For both domestic and international. So that was the key spot. And we were one of the first guys in there. And
I still regret not buying Wilcon. I don't know if you remember Wilcon, but they were a really innovative guy running it. And we could never get together on price. And, I should have just paid him what he wanted. It turned out it was eventually bought by, if my memory's right, Crown Castle. But I should have figured out a way to get that deal done. But it's ones that got away you remember more than the ones you got.
There's so many things like that I should have done that I didn't. And, I kick myself now, but what do you do, right? I mean, It's not like God gave us a full open playbook and said, eat the script on each one of these. So, we were doing our best. And then Hawaii became a very interesting market for us, more from an international perspective, but we made good inroads in the community. People actually loved us there because in 96, we built the submarine fiber cable that touched all 6 islands. And I was able to get permits to do that in 6 months, which is unheard of.
They didn't have a competitor out there to.
No.
What was Bell company name? Hawaiian.
It was Hawaiian Tel.
Hawaiian Tel. So it was Hawaiian Tel.
It was GT. It was a GT company.
Yep.
So we wound up taking over. They were charging 35 cents a minute for an intrastate phone call for the first minute, and then it would drop to 15 cents after that. And the day we got certified, they dropped all calls to a nickel flat. And then obviously now it's part of roaming, but it killed my business plan, of course. But we wound up picking a lot of international traffic, both out of the cable stations we built on the Big Island as well as on Oahu. And Maui, we had the supercomputer site there where the Air Force and others use Haleakala for the deep space telescopes, and similar to the Big Island where Waimea is a large telescope processing facility. Kauai turned out to be great because we built first fiber run to Barking Sands to Kauai. So we were actually connecting Hawaii and Alaska together through Portland. So we tied both of those systems together for the military, which turned out to be great. Again, that was like a Boeing contract, but we were the underlying provider of services. Hawaii got very, very political. I spent a lot of time with Dad in Hawaii and his team, great people. We actually got approved to provide exclusive provision of services to Molokai and Lanai. And then that got overturned after about 8 weeks. Something happened in Washington, D.C. that they realized our money was coming from Japan.
Oh.
That was the excuse for overturning us. But those 3 markets were good. And then we did a lot of things beyond that. So I wound up buying a number of companies like you, but I was buying companies that needed our infrastructure. So I bought Call America in San Luis Obispo. I bought Icon in Seattle. I bought a company in Houston, another one in Abilene. And I was basically putting that traffic onto our network. We started, so one of our advisors was Bill Clark, the former attorney general who worked for Reagan in California. He and his son became consultants of ours to Mexico. And at that time, Mexico was just starting to open up to competition. And collectively, we worked with them, got a Mexican partner out of Guadalajara, and built another company there called Bestel.
Yep.
And that's where my friend Earl Kamsky really shined, his legal background, but also fluent in Spanish. He just made that company and did so well that we wound up making him president of the company. And that's when I got in trouble again with my investor.
Yeah, because you were trying to get that funded, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of dynamics. Maybe walk us through what happened there, because
So I was in the process of trying to move our equity investments in GST from purely Canadian base to a more diversified base, including New York and Wall Street and so on. And we started building that bridge. So we were, instead of having all of the guys in Toronto and Vancouver being our investors and Calgary, we started getting more and more equity interest. So you basically could look at the trading blocks and see where the shares were being shifted from Canadian investors to US. So we hired Morgan Stanley to help us and to raise capital for us. And we had a number of typical CLEC type projects that we needed in the markets that we're expanding into. But we also needed capital to do some of the international activity we were involved in. And Morgan Stanley got mad at me. The key guy, again, was one of these things where you negotiate a deal with one person at Morgan Stanley and he leaves, and then you get this guy that you don't know and doesn't know you and doesn't understand your business, that doesn't necessarily buy into what you're trying to do. And at this point, I was trying to build a very substantial company. I had NTT involved with me. We were looking at tying southwestern U.S. to Mexico and creating a basically campus for NTT to be able to go directly to the customer base instead of having to go through the R box or go through AT&T. We were doing some things that hadn't really fit into a typical CLEC profile, but we had identified every NTT customer in every one of our markets, and we knew where they were at, and we knew what we had to do to reach them. So whether they were tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 1 connection, so fiber connection from us directly or a leased piece from us and from the third party or all third party. So we figured all of that out. And I raised $400 million in early 94.
do you recall at what stock price relative to the?
This was debt. It was another debt piece with
it was debt funding, because debt
piece with a kicker.
is a big thing in that.
But Morgan Stanley came in and they bought in their fund, Princess Gate, they bought like 17 million of equity.
Okay.
So we
About
raised,
million of equity in the public market, or was that?
yeah, it was public. Yeah.
Okay.
Basically on the same basis as everybody else. But then we did a financing, and I made Bear, Rich Lukash, and Morgan go 50-50 on everything.
Okay.
And Morgan was flaming. They were absolutely pissed that they had to share the book with Bear. And Rich was thrilled to death because he knew whoever took the phone order from the investor, whether it was him or Morgan, he would get full economics of it. And I was trying to promote a second company to handle our stock. to be able to get us into the market and to break away a bit from Vancouver. So I'm I got to work Mexico back in. So just before I did the $400 million raise, which was early 96, we went to Morgan Stanley and we said, look, we have this company. We've invested $5 million into it. We're under our covenants, so we're not in violation of any covenants anywhere. But we need $135 million to finance this company. And we're going
network in Mexico, right?
Yes. So
one of the wards, franchise to build out in long distance across Mexico. You guys had one of those, right?
Yes. Not only did we get did our partner get the franchise, we got the exclusive use of the railroad rights of way on our routes.
Okay.
So it's different. In the U.S., the railroad owns the right of way. In Mexico, the government owns the right of way. So we had that major distinction and advantage, and we were already operating in
a huge advantage because you could build along railways. It's their land, in this case, the government-controlled land. Once you have that exclusive right, you could build out network cheaper and quicker than others, and it's a pretty secure route.
And we weren't being held up by the railroad because we were already compensating the government for our franchise. So it worked out very well. At that point, I went to Morgan and they said, no, we don't want you doing this. It's not CLEC related. It's not this, it's not that. I said, yeah, but I've got $5 million invested in it. I've got a great opportunity. And I said, well, let me think about this, but I'll go to another bank. And I went to another bank and I got them interested. They were involved, very active. They said, John, we can raise this money for you, but if there's any chance of you doing it through your Canadian, because they had a Canadian sub, if you do it through the Canadian affiliate, it would flow better because you're still a Canadian company, even though you're listed on Amex and you're moving in NASDAQ. So we wound up doing that. And we wound up bringing in $135 million. And GST received $135 million proceeds on a $5 million investment. Taking another Canadian public company and flipping it. The Morgan Stanley guys were just flaming. I mean, just absolutely off the charts. This guy that was in charge.
What? Why? What was?
Because they were holding a lot of our debt.
Yep.
They had carried the company for a while, but we wound up in the basement of every showroom. Every time you go to the Waldorf, our room was in the basement. And they were upstairs promoting Teleport or Brooks or someone else that
an investor day, investor conference, and where they put you in there matters.
And it was because of the Vancouver connection. That's what their excuse they used. They said, "Well, you didn't buy into us to raise your equity. You raised your money in Canada." I said, "Look, we're here now. I'm willing," and I'd gotten the chairman to step down and resign. I was made chairman at that point. So it was moving along very nicely. And in the process, like 20 days after I'd raised the $400 million, my partner, Earl Kamsky, died.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
He had a massive heart problem. He went into the hospital to have surgery, and he never woke up.
And this Earl's the one you played football with. You were his backup. He joined you.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds like a daughter.
We go back to the startup of ELI, and we go back to 1963, 62 when we played together.
Wow.
So I'm really down. And on top of this, I have a little company called Coke Pipeline that's offered us $25 million of equity and have offered us the use of their 55,000 miles of right of way.
Yeah, this little company, Koch, is spelled Koch,
AOCH,
known
which
as Koch brothers, and one of the biggest industrial pipeline companies
in the country,
in
in
the
the
country.
world, frankly.
Yeah,
And I also have this going on, which
yep,
we had created a model and a business plan to build fiber from Hawaii into California, Mexico, Guatemala, and into Panama. And we had 230 million of pre-sales. And I wound up I had a signed letter of intent with Global Crossing with Gary Winnick.
Did
And
you deal directly with Gary, or who did you deal with?
Gary,
Yeah, how was that?
Gary and I knew each other from the time we were kids. Okay, so
Holy
during
cow.
during the process of my life, I run into him a couple times. I didn't know him that well, but we had pasta together many times. And he's just an interesting guy.
Yep.
But because we were in Hawaii, we spent a lot of time with him because of his cables going through. And our idea was to connect to our existing CLEC operations. So at that point in time, I had 23 California cities
Yeah,
on the EOI network. At that time, we had built fiber from basically Southern Cal to the Oregon border. And then Leadcore, which was the 360 partner, built from Vancouver to the Oregon border,
yep.
California border. And we pre-sold 40 million of fiber on that to Wiltel. And my second son had done that.
To
So,
WorldCom?
yeah, to Wiltel.
Oh, to Wiltel, yep.
So it's now May of 96, of 98. My best friend, Earl, had just died. I had just raised $400 million and people were saying, John, all this stuff that you're doing in Mexico and internationally is phenomenal. And Morgan Stanley saying, no, it isn't. So I was basically divided, and I had been offered a contract to extend my 5-year term with the company was up. And I was mentally in the crapper, frankly.
Mhm.
But I had so many things going, the thing with the Coke guys, the thing with, our friend Gary, plus all of the activity we had in Mexico. And I went into a board meeting and I got a shot, basically. On my wife's birthday at 8:00 in the morning, New York time.
And by who? Like who was?
It was the Morgan Stanley guys.
Yeah.
He,
So
he, he wound
changed.
up he wound up rounding up 2 additional independent directors who had just joined us and really didn't understand the company and just came out of the blue. They were mad at me for doing stuff that Morgan Stanley said we shouldn't do. They were upset that we were still doing this. I haven't told you about the PCS stuff either, but Mario Gabelli and Associates, we had already formed a second partnership at the Bronco Super Bowl with Qualcomm and with Mario to combine our PCS licenses with him. He had Vegas and LA. We had everything around it. We had Four Corners, we had Tucson, we had parts of Phoenix, we had parts of Nevada.
That was all in the context of GST.
It was, and it wasn't. Let me explain this. And this is part of where I get in trouble. GST was a Canadian public company at this point.
Yep.
So, with the board's permission and with full disclosure to all shareholders, we created a new company that was a private company that was held principally by me. And GST had the exclusive right at any time to take that ownership away from me and to transfer it to any other party. Well, the board, this guy from Morgan Stanley didn't like that, didn't understand it, didn't want to listen, and was mad at me because I was doing too many things. And I kept explaining to him, look, we have the fundamentals of what it takes to build an incredible company. And you just look at what happened with Global Crossing. We're a mini version of them, but we're more focused because we have network infrastructure.
The bubble burst too. So at this point,
Exactly.
everyone's stock price is going up. Everyone's worth billions of dollars. There's money flowing. You're cutting deals, and these guys don't like you're doing too much, and they want to move you out and move someone else in.
Yeah, and I upset the guy. There was a meeting in Marrakesh with the Princess Gate guys, and again, my buddy Earl just died. Like the 5 days before, they wanted me to go to Marrakesh to meet all of these international people. And this is like the Nixdorf family. There are only two people that are in Princess Gate that are U.S. Everybody else is international. And I told him, I said, I just can't do it. I've got to be at the funeral. I've got to be able to speak to everybody that's there. I've got to be able to stop crying and say how much this guy meant to me. And they just didn't give a shit. So like 2 weeks later, they called me up and said, John, we want you to leave. So I left. But I then got the rights to deal with Coke. So I was the largest individual shareholder at the time, but I got the rights to deal with Coke.
Were you able to take money off the table at that point, or did the money get locked behind at GSD?
I was locked up for 90 days because I was an officer and director, but after 90 days, I could sell. So, but with this announcement, and everybody knew me and knew what I was doing, started selling.
Oh,
so
gotcha.
The stock went from like $20 to $5. I was able to get a lot of my money out, at 11, 12, $13, which was still, nice for me. But in the end, I still wound up with 400,000 shares that I never was able to sell. But I used that money to launch PFNet, and that became the next big deal with Coke. And for the following year, my buddy from Alcoa, I mentioned him before, Don Branscombe, left Alcoa, joined me, and we went and sat in Morristown. And we looked at
AT&T is headquarters. Just put in perspective, at this point, AT&T is trying to figure out its own future, how to transform itself in many different ways, but including what's it going to do with all this new fiber being built between cities that seems a threat to AT&T's old fiber.
Well, this is where you have a massive background, and that is AT&T's sitting there knowing that they built their fiber first before anybody else. A lot of the fiber they built would not handle the dense wave division multiplexing. A lot of the fiber was directly buried. So they had no way of pulling the old fiber out and new in. And they were besieged by Level 3, who kept saying, which was your company that Hewitt was involved in. And they kept saying that, they're saying, we got 16 conduits going in, just buy one from us and we'll solve your problems. And then Dynegy was in the market. The other Houston-based company that went under was in. So there was a lot of noise going on in the market. And my Alcoa buddy and I
built out, WorldCom had bought the old Wiltel. Quest is building out their network. So
AT&T panicking a bit. And Armstrong, the chairman, kept going out and buying cable operations. And walking into Frank Ayana's office. Frank was the head of AT&T's worldwide network. And you had to talk in his right ear because he's deaf in his left. Frank, I need network that works. The old network won't handle this because they're looking at also moving all the media between all of the locations. So we wound up going in after a year of drinking Barolos at this great little wine store across the street from this great little Italian restaurant at South and Elm for a year. I mean, it was a year solid. We were in there every day at AT&T at 7:30. The security guys actually thought we worked for AT&T. They would just wave us through. We'd be sitting outside Frank's office on his chairs waiting for him to come in. And, oh, you guys again, what the heck are you doing here? After a year, good news, after a year, they decided they needed to do something. Bad news is they insisted on going out for an RFP. And you have 2 weeks to provide a guaranteed fixed price contract to build whatever routes you choose. And AT&T put out 11,000 miles, and you can pick whatever ones you want.
They put out specific routes, and
Specific routes.
so just to enter the story from my perspective, I'm at that point heading up all the network associated with level 3, building out the network, but also the commercial deals that involve the network. I was heavily involved with. So, Crow and O'Hara put me in charge of figuring out how to win this deal with AT&T. Well, we're already building out our network. Our routes are already established, and the routes they're asking for don't line up with the routes we're building, which is like, well, why is that such a big deal to them? Because they're still going to get fiber between the cities. We're covering all the major cities anyways. Why is it so important that we bid on their exact routes? So we get together with the new Wiltel, who's also building out their network, and we figure, well, they're probably trying to play us against Wiltel. Wiltel's thinking the same thing, so we get together with Wiltel and say, we're going to outsmart AT&T. We're going to do a joint bid, and we're pretty much going to tell AT&T, we're the only ones you get network from. You can't use us against each other, and so we're trying in this 2-week period to win the bid.
Yeah.
In a way that's not compliant with what they're asking for. Little did we know you were in there and a couple others who were saying, yeah, we'll build exactly what you're looking for us to build.
Well, this is what won it for us. So we brought in the Coke guys. So we brought in the Coke construction team. We immediately settled with AT&T on what right-of-way we'd use, because Coke had 55,000 miles of right-of-way. And AT&T told us exactly what they told you. We want it here. We said, okay, does that mean we can use your right-of-way? They said, yes. So Coke and my guys got on the phone, and we called every swinging contractor that had ever worked on the AT&T route in the entire 11,000 miles in that 2-week time. And we locked everyone we could into a guaranteed fixed price bid to build a 6 conduit system, 4 inches. And we walked into AT&T and we said, here's your price. And they said, okay, we'll take it.
Wow.
That price was so close to what they had calculated their own construction team would have done without their manpower included in that cost. So to get a third party to come in and do it was fantastic for them. For us, it was a tremendous thing because we were able to pick the routes that we chose, and then we did a deal, a sales swap with Touch America. So Touch America, we didn't include, but we knew Touch America was in there at the same time we were, and we knew that they knew Chicago to San Francisco better than we did. So we took New York to
Montana Power, who decided to sell all of their
power
utilities, collect a whole bunch of cash, pump a whole bunch of cash, and use that to build out primarily fiber networks right as the boom was coming to an end and the bust was beginning. And part of what they used it for was to build out routes for AT&T, just like you were, but in different parts of the country.
Well, guess where they got the idea? Remember the first route I told you I built? Alcoa.
Yes.
So
yes.
that team of guys understood the business. They understood everything I taught them and everything they learned from them. And we were both in there at the same, we were actually in different rooms at the same time dealing with AT&T and the contracts. But again, what convinced AT&T was the price that we came up with was so close to what they actually expected. And of course, they knew what they paid every other contractor to work on it. And they saw that we were willing to take a reasonable, rational price. And we wound up getting 66% of the infrastructure. Not
Yeah,
only
meaning you were able to keep 2/3 infrastructure to do whatever you wanted to do with. Well, so you're delivering the network to them. They're paying most of the bill. You now have a bunch of excess network that you could then put fiber in the conduits, sell the conduits, monetize in other ways. So
and
you're
in retrospect, that's probably what we should have done. But instead, we had guys that wanted to build a full company, build AT&T too. But there were some real advantages to the AT&T contract. We got them to agree to jointly market dark fiber. They brought in their dark fiber marketing team to help us do that. I did the swap sale with Montana Power. We got everything in their network and $50 million of cash. We wound up also doing a maintenance share. So because we were building on an existing AT&T right-of-way, even though we were putting in 6 conduits, we were only using 1 shared with them. The other 5 conduits were sitting there, but there was an existing AT&T cable in the route. So instead of having to pay market-based for hiring our own management team to run and deal with the maintenance, we were able to take advantage of their shared deal, which was tremendous saving. It just increased our business plan tremendously over that. So I get all of this stuff done, and Morgan Stanley shows up. I got the contract signed with AT&T. I've got Lucent agreeing to buy 24 fibers and sell us fiber at like 2.5 cents per fiber per foot. And we go out to raise money. We're dealing with BlackRock. We're dealing with Carson. We're dealing with Texas Pacific. There are like 12 names we went on. And they're
all with big, ability to
big,
finance.
big bucks. And every place we went, this Morgan Stanley guy blackballed me.
Same guy from prior.
Same guy from GSD. He goes out and has his entire Morgan Stanley team blackball me. And it was difficult, but as part of our capital raise, and Coke was involved, so that at that point there were just 2 partners, me at 50% and Coke at 50%. We're 50-50 partners.
Crazy. But, you were bringing huge value. I mean, you pieced together this deal, you won the contract.
I brought in $4 million of cash. Coke put in $4 million, and they put in 55,000 miles of right of way. And I brought in the AT&T contract. So we had, it was a good deal for both of us. But we brought in a Wall Street partner, and he said, "John, I'm sorry, you've broken too many eggs. This guy is from Morgan, hates you. He's blocking you every place." Well, what am I to do with that?
Yep.
So we're going through the list. We're talking about John Legger. We were talking about him. We talked about the key.
Ledger at the time still would have been at Global Crossing.
Yeah.
Right? He went on from Global Crossing to be the CEO of T-Mobile and had an extraordinarily successful run at T-Mobile.
And then we talked about Russo at AT&T, Lucent. We talked about
what's her first name?
Patty Russo, I think was her name.
Yep.
We talked about Dan Hesse. We talked about several others, and we wound up settling on Bob Annunziata. And Bob had a great reputation, did a great job with Teleport, and had done a deal to sell Teleport to AT&T. So everybody assumed he was okay. And then we brought in Buddy Pickle out of Level 3 and the Keywood side. And Buddy,
league of mine in the was it Level 3 or MFS? In MFS days, he was never with Level 3, but he was with us at MFS, and then went on to do other things after we sold that to WorldCom.
Yeah, and it was an interesting process for me to have to now take the back seat and sit and listen in board meetings and so on. And I was my own personal life was like ripped out. I mean, it was bad enough to lose ELI, and then
Yep.
it was GST, but then to have GST come back and impact me at PFNet. So that was kind of the very, very difficult issue for me. And
Yep. And just going back to GST for a second, because we didn't talk about what happened at GST after you left, and we don't need to go into a lot of specifics, but they were one of the first companies to hit the wall when the meltdown started to happen, maybe even slightly before,
yeah,
considered being a meltdown. And then TW Telecom, Larissa Herta ended up buying it for still a good amount of money. It was like $600-700 million, relative to what happened a couple of years later.
so
Anything you want to share on that period between when you left and?
well, it really kind of got interesting because the same guy at Morgan Stanley was the guy that controlled that transaction. And, Carson came in after I'd left and offered them $300 million for equity. Coke had offered with me $25 million for equity. I had also just sold that software company. I had taken it public that we paid $8 million for, and we got 144 million. So we were sitting on a bunch of cash when I left. I had raised 400 million. We got the money from selling NACT, which is the software company. We had the 135 million that we had picked up out of the Mexico deal, and they were sitting on this cash at that time, and the company just went down. Well, the guy I hired to when my buddy died to be president was Joe Basil, ex cable and wireless guy, came in and ran the company. He didn't like any of the guys that I had, so he started bringing in his guys. What okay, so part of GST, my Japanese partner and I bought. We bought the Hawaiian operation.
Yep.
That company was losing 600,000 a month when I took it over. Within 3 months, we were making 300,000 a month. What we found out by going through the circuits was that GST had double ordered all the switching circuits. So as a startup providing switch services, they had double circuits. Then I went to Southern Cross and picked up a brand new submarine capacity that had been there about a year that GST never bought anything on. And I bought that, and it wound up slashing our connectivity from Hawaii to California and to Oregon, frankly. So GST's financially was profitable if they had dealt with their circuit costs, but they didn't. And we had 12 switches that they were rolling out. And why did it sell? And why did it sell instead of Carson? Why did it taking 200 million out of Carson? I suspect the Morgan Stanley guy was sitting on a bunch of GST debt, which is 13 7/8. And he looked at the management team that he had there and looked at the management team at Time Warner and said, if we can do this deal, we can get more business from Time Warner Corporate. So they basically rolled over GST, sold it for 650 million. And that's my version of the story.
Yep. Okay, so fast forward, Buddy Pickle comes in, and Buddy was the CEO. So Bob was there, but Bob at that point sounded like he was chairman.
Yeah.
Was he day to day, or was he?
Well, that's part of the problem. He spent a lot of time. So they moved the company from Washington State, where I lived, to Washington, D.C., except Bob lived in New Jersey.
Yep.
So Bob spent his time decorating his office there. Buddy spent his time in a palatial palace outside Washington, D.C., where he was decorating his office there.
And Buddy, who I knew Buddy, so wasn't close to him, but I knew him. He was a pure sales guy. I mean, he was a sales guy from AT&T, from MCI, maybe even Sprint. He never had run a company. He went and joined up, I forget the name of the company, but with another AT&T, with Alex Mandel. So he was number 2 there. That company, Intelligent, was trying to do a wireless, local loop play. That wasn't working out. So Buddy leaves that. And this is now the first time he's really responsible for running a company. And when I say he was a sales guy, he was a sales guy. I mean, he was a trying to sales guy who, thought about everything from the lens of a salesperson, but never really was responsible for running a business and building a full business. So now you who, I don't know you well, but I feel like I know you really well after this conversation. You're kind of a hardcore, grassroots. I know how everything works. I know all the details. I know how to cut deals. I know how to make the business work financially. But you probably, like a lot of people in those days, you're being creative, and sometimes you could be over creative. So they bring in Buddy, wears the right suits and says the right things, knows how to sell as a living, but now he's responsible for running the company. My guess is the culture change was dramatic.
No, you're right, Dan. I mean, I've done a lot of things right, but I also did a lot of things wrong. I mean, if I would have kissed a few more butts, probably would have been a lot further in my career and in my life. But I saw the problem you and I both had was time. We had such little time to be able to become a meaningful company. And, I got to speak to Harvard. I was invited by the MBA class, and this is back in early 2000. And the reason they contacted me is that I built 3 companies that were each worth at some point $1 billion. They had met several fun entrepreneurs that had built a $3 billion company, but nobody had done $3 billion companies from scratch. Basically working out of my garage with my kids and, a handful of other people. But to do that, I really didn't have a lot of time. And that was the critical issue. And when I lost Earl Kamsky, I mean, this is a guy that I knew if I were on a playing field with him, I knew exactly what he would do. I knew exactly what he would say, and I would know exactly where he was going. And instead, I liked Bob. I met Bob at a few investor conferences, but I really didn't know Bob. I knew Buddy, but I really didn't know Buddy. So I made mistakes probably in helping pick some of these guys. But
there's also the times, and that we're at the 2-hour mark, so we're definitely going to need to wrap up. But it was also all hell was breaking loose, and AT&T's building their network, but they're late to the game, and they got other problems. Everyone's got problems at this point. Everyone's trying to survive.
9/11
is going to zero.
Yeah.
And then so did you guys? How much of the network did you guys even get a chance to build out?
Well, we built almost half of it. And the Coke guys wound up with managing our contractor for AT&T to finish it, or finish most of it. So that worked out very well for AT&T. But when 9/11 happened, the Coke guys, I'm being summoned by the boss. A few minutes. Okay, let him out. Thank you. The boss just asked me if she could let the dogs out.
Perfect.
I've been married for 57 years, and it's taken me a long time to realize she is the boss. Well, that goes to show how slow a learner I am at times. And again, GST bubbled over into PFNet, and so after that, I ran the Hawaiian operations with my Japanese partner. That wound up being sold to Hawaiian Tel. That worked out fine. I wound up
PFNet, back to PFNet though, just to end that story. PFNet becomes, Velocita was the name of it. Am I pronouncing that right?
Velocita. Yeah.
And then Velocita ends up going through its own bankruptcy, and AT&T picks it up for probably a relatively small amount of money.
Yeah.
and again, that was at the time when all these bankruptcies were happening, and
Right.
so
It happened in the same time frame that 9/11. So when this happened with the loss of the market for dark fiber to people went away, our biggest opportunity was Verizon, and Bob was supposed to be able to close that with Buddy, and they weren't able to get it. Comcast, got some of AT&T's fiber as part of our deal. So that was another big potential dark fiber. I offered to go on the road and go block by block, utility by utility on our entire route in a motorhome with a couple of my guys and sell dark fiber on the way. And the guys just, at that point, they had thrown their hands up, they were done. So
Yep.
the Coke guys walked, Cisco came in. So the structure of the deal was Coke and I put $4 million up a piece. Then Odyssey Partners put up 135. So our half became a third. And then Cisco put in 335 million of equity. And I'd already had Lucent come in for several hundred million for debt, and Cisco put up matching debt to go with their, but they just kind of gave up. The market was what was, as you mentioned, and it opened doors for people to come in and clean house, frankly, which I think turned out very good.
went to why you guys ended up selling that.
Yeah. Then I bought
so-
this Canadian company.
So maybe I'll end with the question I began with is, as you look back and now that we've talked through the entire journey, I think one of the biggest gifts we all, with a few exceptions of people who end up in a really bad spot, jail or otherwise. But what most of us, I think the gift we could take is, we did exciting things, we did innovative things, we stuck our necks out there. Sometimes our necks got chopped off a bit, but most of us persevered, and most of us can look back and say, a lot of this would not have happened if not for the role I played. And if anyone could say that, you can say that. You had your fingers in so many different areas at so many different times. Not everything ended up the way you or I would have wanted it to at every point in time, but boy, what an exciting life, what an exciting journey. And, and you'll always have that, and no one can take that away from you.
Dan, I appreciate that.
Family guy.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you and what you've done, because you were able to stay with it and focus and go through good and bad times and come out doing just a tremendous job. And again, I look up to you and appreciate you taking the time with me, and glad to get out my story. I thought about writing a book, but nobody would believe it.
Well, you'll have this to share with family and friends. So it'll be probably a month and a half from now released. And I can't wait till people get to know who you are, what you did, and how you did it, because it's a fun story and one that a lot of people can learn from.
Dan, thank you. Look forward to getting together with you at some time and breaking bread and having a good glass of wine.
Yeah, let's get some of that pasta that you used to have with.
And more stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe on your listening platform. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Courtney Caruso with support from Kendall Weinberg, Emily Reed, and Gibson Siegert.